The sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling parking lot of Peachtree Mall in downtown Atlanta. It was the kind of scorching summer afternoon that made the asphalt shimmer like a mirage, and even the pigeons had taken shelter under the scattered trees near the mall entrance. At precisely 2:45 p.m., a gleaming white Range Rover Autobiography, price tag north of $125,000, sat helplessly tilted to one side, its rear right tire completely flat. Standing beside the vehicle was Mrs. Wheeler, though everyone in her upscale neighborhood knew her better as the HOA lady. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was beginning to wilt in the Georgia heat, and her expensive silk blouse had started showing signs of distress. She'd just finished a 3-hour shopping spree, armed with bags from Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and Nordstrom, only to find her 3-month-old luxury SUV betraying her in the most inconvenient way possible. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she muttered, pacing back and forth in her red-bottomed heels. "I paid extra for the premium tire package." Her voice carried across the parking lot, causing a few shoppers to glance her way. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here was a woman dressed head to toe in designer clothes, surrounded by shopping bags that could pay someone's monthly rent, unable to handle a simple flat tire. Mrs. Wheeler's day had started perfectly. She'd spent the morning criticizing her neighbor's choice of mailbox color. It was technically sunset red, when the HOA guidelines clearly specified cardinal red, followed by a satisfying complaint about someone's trash bin being visible from the street. The shopping trip was supposed to be her reward for maintaining the neighborhood's standards. Now she stood in the sweltering heat, jabbing at her phone's screen with perfectly manicured nails, trying to get through to roadside assistance. The call kept dropping, and the premium customer service line of her dealership had put her on hold twice. Her frustration grew with each passing minute, her face flushing not just from the heat, but from the sheer indignity of the situation. A group of teenagers walked by, giggling as they recorded her predicament on their phones. "Don't you dare put that on social media," she snapped, which only made them laugh harder. She could already imagine the neighborhood group chat buzzing with news of her situation. The same people she'd cited for improper lawn ornament placement would be having a field day with this. The contents of her shopping bags were starting to feel like they were burning a hole in her guilt. She'd just spent thousands on designer items, but hadn't bothered to learn how to change a tire. Her husband had suggested taking a basic car maintenance course at the community center last month, but she dismissed it as unnecessary since they had premium roadside assistance. As she waited, shifting her weight from one expensive heel to another, she didn't notice the well-dressed man walking towards her car. He just finished a business lunch at the mall's high-end restaurant, and his trained eye had immediately spotted the vehicle's predicament. What happened next would become one of the most talked-about incidents in local social media history, though not for the reasons anyone might have expected. The man approaching Mrs. Wheeler's stranded Range Rover didn't look like your typical luxury car dealership owner. Wearing dark blue jeans, a casual navy polo shirt, and comfortable walking shoes, he could have been any other shopper at the mall. But Mr. T, as his employees affectionately called him, was actually the owner of the largest luxury car dealership in the Southeast, the same dealership where Mrs. Wheeler had purchased her now troubled vehicle. He'd just finished lunch at the mall's upscale restaurant, where he'd been discussing a major expansion of his business empire. 20 years ago, he'd started as a mechanic in his father's small garage, learning the ins and outs of every luxury vehicle that came through their doors. Now, he owned a chain of dealerships across 3 states, but he'd never lost his passion for the hands-on aspects of the business. As he walked through the parking lot, heading back to his own car, his trained eye immediately spotted the Range Rover's predicament. The rear passenger tire wasn't just flat, it had picked up what looked like a nasty piece of construction debris. From where he stood, he could even see the metal glinting in the afternoon sun. He watched for a moment as Mrs. Wheeler struggled with her phone, her frustration evident in every movement. Having dealt with thousands of customers over the years, he recognized the signs of someone having a truly terrible day. The stack of designer shopping bags around her feet suggested she'd had better plans for her afternoon than dealing with a flat tire in the scorching heat. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, approaching with a friendly smile. "I couldn't help but notice you're having some trouble with your tire. I'd be happy to help you get back on the road." His voice was warm and professional, the same tone he used countless times to put nervous first-time car buyers at ease. He could see how luxury vehicle was from his dealership. He recognized the distinctive license plate frame and the special edition badge that only his dealership offered in the state. In fact, he vaguely remembered signing off on the paperwork for this particular vehicle just a few months ago, though he hadn't dealt with the customer directly. What happened next would prove to be a masterclass in assumptions and their consequences. As he moved closer, reaching into his back pocket for his business card out of habit, Mrs. Wheeler's body language shifted dramatically. Her shoulders tensed, her grip tightened on her designer purse, and her expression transformed from mere frustration to something altogether different. The security camera overlooking this section of the parking lot would later capture every detail of what followed, a video that would eventually be viewed by millions. But in that moment, neither of them knew they were about to become the subject of a viral story about prejudice, assumption, and the unexpected ways life teaches its most valuable lessons. The man took another step forward, about to explain his connection to her vehicle, completely unaware that his simple offer of assistance was about to spark a chain of events that would make headlines across social media and change multiple lives in unexpected ways. The atmosphere in the parking lot shifted as dramatically as a summer storm rolling across the Georgia sky. Mrs. Wheeler's response to the friendly offer of help came swift and sharp, cutting through the humid air like a knife. "Stay back," she barked, taking 2 quick steps backward. Her designer heels clicked against the asphalt as she positioned herself on the other side of her disabled Range Rover. "I don't need your help. I don't know who you are or what you want, but I have the dealership on speed dial." The small crowd that had gathered nearby, mostly shoppers heading to and from their cars, slowed their pace, sensing the growing tension. A young couple pushing a shopping cart stopped completely, the wife whispering something to her husband while discreetly pulling out her phone. The dealership owner stood perfectly still, his hands visible at his sides, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the uncalled-for hostility. "Ma'am, I actually work with." "I said I don't need your help." Mrs. Wheeler's voice rose higher, drawing even more attention. She clutched her Louis Vuitton bag closer to her chest, her knuckles white against the designer leather. "I know exactly what kind of scam this is. You people see a woman alone with a luxury vehicle and think you can take advantage." A middle-aged man loading groceries into his truck nearby shook his head in disapproval, though it wasn't clear whether his disappointment was directed at Mrs. Wheeler's behavior or the situation in general. 2 teenage girls standing near the mall entrance had their phones out, recording the scene while trying to look like they were just checking their messages. "Ma'am," the dealership owner tried again, his voice remaining calm and professional, "I'm simply offering to help with your flat tire. I can see from the license plate frame that this vehicle was purchased from." "Oh, so you've been watching my car?" Mrs. Wheeler's voice took on an even more accusatory tone. She fumbled with her phone, her French manicured fingers trembling slightly as she tried to dial. "Security. I'm calling mall security right now. And I'm going to call my dealership. I know the owner personally." The irony of her last statement hung in the air like the thick Georgia humidity. The dealership owner's expression remained neutral, but anyone watching closely might have caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. A mall security guard had indeed started making his way over, having noticed the commotion. He was walking unhurriedly, though. He'd recognized the dealership owner from the many local TV commercials and charity events he sponsored in the community. "I don't appreciate being harassed in broad daylight," Mrs. Wheeler continued, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "I drive a $100,000 vehicle. I live in the Heritage Hills community. I'm the president of the HOA. I only deal with authorized professionals." The growing crowd of onlookers had gotten larger, with several people now openly recording the interaction on their phones. The dealership owner simply reached into his back pocket, pulled out his business card, and placed it carefully on the concrete barrier next to the Range Rover. As he turned to walk away, Mrs. Wheeler was already dialing the dealership's customer service number, demanding to speak to the owner about some suspicious person in the parking lot. She had no idea that her call was about to take a turn she never expected, and that the next few minutes would change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. The customer service line at the luxury dealership rang twice before a cheerful voice answered. Good afternoon, thank you for calling Elite Motors. This is Mr. Rodriguez. How may I assist you today? Mrs. Wheeler's voice came out in a rush of indignation. This is Mrs. Wheeler. I purchased my Range Rover autobiography from you 3 months ago, and I need to speak to the owner immediately. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, even though the man who'd offered help was already walking away. There's someone suspicious in the parking lot claiming they can help with my flat tire. I think they're trying to scam me. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Rodriguez, the service department manager who'd worked at the dealership for over 15 years, cleared his throat. Mrs. Wheeler, could you describe this person for me, please? He's wearing jeans and a navy polo shirt, she said, her free hand gesturing wildly even though no one could see her. He just walked up like he owned the place and… Ma'am, Mr. Rodriguez interrupted gently. Was this a tall man, about 6 feet, with a grey-peppered beard? Mrs. Wheeler blinked in surprise. Yes. Have you had other complaints about him? I knew he was suspicious. I want to speak to the owner right now. This is unacceptable. I'm a premium customer. Another pause, longer this time. In the background, Mrs. Wheeler could hear muffled laughter from other staff members. Mrs. Wheeler, Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professionalism, I believe you just met Mr. T himself, the owner of Elite Motors. He's been featured in all our commercials and on the billboard right outside our dealership. He started as a mechanic 20 years ago and still loves helping customers personally. The phone nearly slipped from Mrs. Wheeler's manicured fingers. Her face, already flushed from the heat and excitement, turned an impossible shade of red. She slowly turned to look at the business card the man had left on the concrete barrier. There it was, in elegant silver lettering, Mr. T, owner and CEO, Elite Motors. The small crowd that had gathered was starting to disperse, but not before several people had recognized the dealership owner from his numerous TV appearances and community events. A woman walking past with her teenage daughter shook her head disapprovingly. That's the man who donated 50 computers to our high school last month, the teenager said, just loud enough for Mrs. Wheeler to hear. He also sponsors the annual Christmas toy drive, added another passerby, deliberately raising his voice. My brother's kids got presents last year because of him. Mrs. Wheeler's hands began to shake as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. On her phone, Mr. Rodriguez was still talking. Would you like me to send our mobile service unit to help with your tire, Mrs. Wheeler? Mr. T already texted us about your situation. He wants to make sure you're taken care of, despite, well… The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone still watching. The security guard who had arrived earlier was now leaning against his patrol cart, trying to hide his amusement. A few yards away, a group of shoppers were huddled around a phone, already watching the video someone had posted of the incident. The business card seemed to mock her from its place on the barrier. Mrs. Wheeler picked it up with trembling fingers, reading and rereading the name. She could already imagine the gossip spreading through her prestigious neighborhood, the whispers at the country club, the sidelong glances at the next HOA meeting. But worse than any of that was the dawning realization of her own behavior. The man she'd just accused of being suspicious was the same person whose signature was on her vehicle's paperwork, whose dealership she'd bragged about at dinner parties, whose charitable works she'd praised at social gatherings, without ever having met him in person. As if to put a final exclamation point on her humiliation, her phone buzzed with a notification. The video was already going viral on social media, with the hashtag #EliteMotorsCaren quickly gaining traction. Her perfectly planned shopping day had turned into a nightmare, and there was no premium customer service package that could fix this situation. The next 24 hours unfolded like a slow-motion car crash that Mrs. Wheeler couldn't stop watching. By sunset, the video had already racked up over 50,000 views on social media. By breakfast the next morning, that number had multiplied tenfold, and local news stations were running the story in their morning broadcasts. Luxury Regcts HELP from her own dealership CEO read one headline. Another local news site went with HOA President's PARKNG Lotu Projugadisi GOES VIRAL. The comment sections were flooded with people sharing their own experiences with prejudice, along with messages of support for the dealership owner. Mrs. Wheeler's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she'd gotten home the previous evening. First came the text from her neighbor, "Isn't that the same dealership owner you bragged about at the garden club last month?" Then a message from another HOA board member, "We need to talk about your position as president." The community Facebook group she'd once ruled with an iron fist, issuing warnings about improper paint colors and non-regulation mailbox heights, had turned into a hotbed of discussion about her behavior. Someone had even dug up her old complaint posts and paired them with screenshots from the viral video. Maybe if her mailbox wasn't the wrong shade of red, this wouldn't have happened, read one comment with over 100 likes. Her usual morning routine of patrolling the neighborhood for violations felt impossible now. Every time she looked out her window, she caught neighbors quickly turning away or pretending to be busy with their phones. The same people who used to fear her clipboard and camera now had something much more powerful, a viral video showcasing her worst moment. Around noon, her phone lit up with a call from the country club. The board wanted to discuss her membership status. She let it go to voicemail. The charity organization where she served as event coordinator had already sent an email asking her to step back from planning the upcoming fundraiser. The mobile service unit from Elite Motors arrived promptly at 2 p.m. to fix her tire, just as Mr. Rodriguez had promised. The technician was nothing but professional, though Mrs. Wheeler couldn't help but notice he kept glancing at his phone, where she caught a glimpse of the viral video playing on his screen. "The boss insisted this service should be free of charge, ma'am," the technician said as he finished up. "He said to tell you that Elite Motors values all its customers." The emphasis on all wasn't lost on her. As she watched him drive away, Mrs. Wheeler noticed a group of teenage girls walking past her house, phones out, giggling. One of them pointed at her Range Rover and whispered something that made the others burst into laughter. The luxury vehicle she'd once seen as a status symbol now felt like a beacon drawing unwanted attention. The local news van parked across the street wasn't helping either. They'd been there since morning, hoping to get a comment. Her husband had suggested a social media apology, but every time she opened the Twitter app, the trending hashtag Elite Motors Karen made her close it again. Her daughter, away at college, had sent a text that hit hardest of all. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened. Remember when my best friend came over last Thanksgiving and you made those comments about her family? This isn't new behavior." By late afternoon, her pristinely organized world had completely unraveled. The same community that had once feared her critical eye now watched her every move, waiting to see how she would handle the consequences of her actions. The security of her social standing, built on years of enforcing rules and maintaining appearances, had crumbled in less than a day. As she sat in her home office, staring at the wall of HOA certificates and community service awards, Mrs. Wheeler couldn't ignore the painful truth any longer. The very prejudices she denied having had been captured on camera for the world to see. The carefully crafted image she'd built was shattered, and no amount of HOA regulations could fix it. 1 week after the incident, Mrs. Wheeler sat in the waiting area of Elite Motors, clutching her appointment slip like a lifeline. The Range Rover needed its scheduled maintenance, and despite her embarrassment, she couldn't avoid the dealership forever. Her usual confidence had been replaced by something unfamiliar, humility. The showroom buzzed with activity. A young couple admired a sleek sports car while their children pressed their faces against the windows. An elderly man chatted with a sales representative about trading in his old sedan, and everywhere Mrs. Wheeler looked, she saw the face of the man she'd insulted. Mr. T smiled down from posters highlighting the dealership's community involvement and customer service awards. "Mrs. Wheeler," the service advisor's voice made her jump. "We're ready for your vehicle now." As she handed over her keys, she noticed how the staff treated her, professionally, but with knowing looks. The viral video had hit 2 million views by now. Her husband had shown her some of the comments last night, trying to help her understand the impact of her actions. Sometimes, he'd said gently, life gives us chances to learn, even if they're painful. While waiting, she watched the dealership's daily operations. Mr. T was there, moving through the showroom in his usual casual attire, greeting customers warmly regardless of how they were dressed. She observed as he spent 20 minutes helping an elderly woman understand her car's new features, then joked with a teenager who was there with his dad to buy his first car. "He does that every day," said a voice beside her. It was Mr. Rodriguez, the service manager she'd spoken to on that fateful day. "Doesn't matter if someone's buying our most expensive car or just getting an oil change. That's why we all love working here." Mrs. Wheeler nodded, her throat tight. Through the showroom windows, she could see the mall where everything had happened. The memory made her cheeks burn, but something else was burning too, the desire to make things right. Her phone buzzed, another message from the HOA board. They'd called an emergency meeting to discuss her position. The old Mrs. Wheeler would have fought back, threatened legal action, called in favors. But sitting there, watching the dealership owner treat everyone with equal respect, she realized something important. She opened her phone's notes app and began to type, "Dear board members, I am writing to tender my resignation as HOA president." The words flowed easily, surprisingly so. She wrote about personal growth, about learning from mistakes, about the need for new leadership that could bring the community together rather than divide it. A burst of laughter drew her attention. Mr. T was showing a group of kids the engine of a display car, explaining how it worked with genuine enthusiasm. One of the children was wearing worn-out shoes and a patched jacket, but Mr. T treated him with the same attention he'd given to the wealthy couple buying a luxury SUV earlier. The service advisor returned with her paperwork. "Your car is all set, Mrs. Wheeler. Mr. T insisted on handling this service personally. He also left a note for you." She handed over an envelope along with the keys. Mrs. Wheeler opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple message. "Your vehicle is in perfect condition. If you're interested, we're hosting a community car care workshop next weekend. Everyone is welcome. Mr. T." She stared at the invitation for a long moment. The old Mrs. Wheeler would have scoffed at the idea of attending a public workshop. But the person she was becoming? She might just learn something valuable. And maybe, just maybe, it could be the first step toward real change. The lesson wasn't just about cars or customer service. It was about looking beyond appearances, about treating everyone with dignity, about the possibility of growth even after public mistakes. As she walked to her car, Mrs. Wheeler realized that sometimes the most expensive things in life aren't sold in luxury dealerships. They're the lessons we learn about ourselves along the way. 3 months after the parking lot incident, the community center's main hall was packed for Elite Motors' monthly car care workshop. In the back row, barely noticeable among the crowd, sat Mrs. Wheeler. She'd traded her designer outfits for comfortable jeans and a simple blouse, and for the first time in years, she felt truly comfortable in her own skin. The past months had been a journey of transformation. After resigning from the HOA presidency, she'd faced a choice: retreat into bitterness or embrace change. The viral video of her mistake had now reached over 5 million views, but surprisingly, that number no longer bothered her as much as it once had. Mr. T stood at the front of the room, dressed in his signature casual style, teaching basic car maintenance to a diverse group of community members. "Everyone should know how to check their tire pressure," he was saying, demonstrating with a gauge. "It doesn't matter what kind of car you drive. This knowledge can save you time and money." Mrs. Wheeler found herself taking notes, something her former self would have considered beneath her. Next to her sat the teenage daughter of her former gardener, who'd lost his job when Mrs. Wheeler had reported him to the HOA for parking his work truck on the street. Today, they were sharing a manual and discussing oil change intervals. "You know," the girl whispered during a break, "my dad got his job back at the new HOA president's house. They even let him park his truck there now." The comment stung, but Mrs. Wheeler nodded, accepting it as part of her learning process. She'd spent the past months making amends where she could. Some people weren't ready to forgive, and she was learning to accept that too. During the hands-on portion of the workshop, Mr. T approached her group. "Mrs. Wheeler, would you like to demonstrate how to check brake fluid?" The old her would have recoiled at the thought of getting her hands dirty. The new her grabbed the dipstick with determination. As she successfully completed the task, scattered applause broke out. She looked up to see several familiar faces, former HOA members, neighbors, even some of the people who had witnessed the original incident. Their expressions had changed from judgment to something closer to respect. After the workshop, Mrs. Wheeler approached Mr. T. "I've been wanting to say something for months now," she began, her voice steady. "That day in the parking lot, it wasn't just about a flat tire. It was about years of prejudices I didn't even realize I had." Mr. T nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know what makes a luxury car special, Mrs. Wheeler? It's not the price tag or the brand name. It's the attention to detail, the commitment to excellence, and most importantly, the understanding that every part has to work together in harmony. Communities are the same way." He gestured around the room, where people from all walks of life were chatting, sharing stories, and helping clean up. "See that gentleman in the corner? He used to be afraid to drive through your neighborhood because of all the HOA complaints. Now he's teaching others about engine maintenance. That's real luxury. The freedom to be part of something bigger than ourselves." As she helped stack chairs after the workshop, Mrs. Wheeler caught a glimpse of herself in one of the center's windows. Her hair wasn't perfectly styled anymore. There was a smudge of oil on her cheek, and she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. That evening, she parked her Range Rover in her driveway, but something was different. She didn't see it as a status symbol anymore, but as a reminder of the day her life changed. Her neighbor waved from across the street, a simple gesture that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. Opening her laptop, she navigated to the community forum she'd once used to post violation notices. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she began to type, "Looking to start a neighborhood carpooling group. All vehicles welcome. Knowledge sharing encouraged. No judgment, just community." As responses began popping up, tentative at first, then increasingly enthusiastic, Mrs. Wheeler realized that true change isn't about grand gestures or public apologies. It's about the small decisions we make every day, the willingness to learn from our mistakes, and the courage to build bridges where we once built walls. The viral video that had once seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of a better one. Outside, the sun was setting on her neighborhood, the same streets, the same houses, but somehow everything looked different through eyes that had learned to see past the surface, past prejudice, and into the heart of what really matters: the people who make a community worth being part of.